Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, death slayers, spies, and fastless minions, meat sacks, refugees. I'm a useful idiot. Welcome. And let's go global and talk about Muslim refugees. And I've kind of stayed away from this because there's just a ton of material out there on it supporting all kinds of different viewpoints. And certainly it's a hot button issue that gets people pretty riled up. And I certainly can relate to a lot of the issues they're having in Europe. Their welfare programs are just heavily burdened right now by the influx of refugees and then the kind of problems they're having with the refugees both in Scandinavia and France and other areas of Europe is certainly very, very disturbing. And they've got their hands full. But I look at the United States and I look at Canada and I think our problems here with Islamic refugees are relative, and all this hysteria and fear out there I think is really misguided. Once again, I just try and look at the facts. And the big picture, of course, I definitely agree with a lot of people who say, well, why do we need more people coming to the United States and living on our welfare system? And that's a good point. I do have issue with certainly a lot of immigrants coming here, particularly illegal immigrants having access to welfare and other American benefits. We certainly need to sort those issues out. But that said, it's a fairly small percentage. I know there's a lot of numbers that have been thrown around out there. Hillary talking about bringing in 65,000 Syrian refugees, which is really a drop in the bucket, especially when you take that amount of people and you spread it out across the country. It's a very small amount. In fact, you look at the big picture, 784,000 refugees have resettled in the U.S. since September 11th, 2001, the big day. And exactly 3 have been arrested for being involved in planning activities. 2 of them were planning activities outside of the U.S., and 1 was not a credible threat by any stretch of the imagination. So we really have no basis. All the domestic terrorists that supposedly have been discovered all seem to be entrapment cases by the FBI and American law enforcement agencies trapping these poor fools like those idiots in Newburgh, New York. And so anyway, there really is no background. And then you look at the fact the number of Americans killed annually, and you look at a chart, it's fairly telling because the number killed by Islamic jihadist immigrants, Americans killed, was 2. But far right-wing terrorists killed 5 Americans. Armed toddlers actually killed 21 Americans. Lightning killed 31 Americans. Lawnmowers killed 69 Americans. Buses hit and killed 264 Americans. Falling out of bed killed 737 Americans. And shot by another American, 11,737. So once again, this fear of Islamic terrorism doesn't seem to be very credible in this country. And then you get into the screening process as well. I know there's been some talk about Obama adding extra background checks and vetoing that, and people are worried about the vetting process. But I don't know what I understand about the vetting process. It's pretty thorough, and the idea that a lot of Islamic terrorists are going to be swarming to the United States and unleash Sharia law seems to be pretty slim. There's 2 interviews with the UN agency. They're checked against 3 databases: the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Then it's filtered through the National Counterterrorism Center. And then there's face-to-face interviews with Department of Homeland Security representatives overseas. The average processing is 2 years. And for the most part, the focus is on the most vulnerable: widows, children, the elderly, and the infirm. And granted, the 2-year process might be a moot point if they want to speed this up. But once again, we don't really have any evidence to show that this influx of a small amount of Muslims is really going to have any effect on the United States at all. In fact, another article that came out said that a political scientist in Chicago said that analysis of every suicide attack since 1980 said 95% have been motivated by politics, not religion, specifically military interventions. So that's something to bear in mind overall when looking at the motivations for for suicide attacks and terrorism around the world. It has a lot less to do with religion, and so this fear of Islamic immigrants, based on the fact that they support terrorism, once again is misguided. It's not based on their religion. It's a political viewpoint, and if they are for terrorism, they're not necessarily going to want to move to the United States. And this idea that they're going to try and slip in through and create these sleeper cells, well, that's a possibility, but the small percentage, once again, would be so relative that I'm not sure why we have this overwhelming fear across the country about it. And then another one I like is the fact that Pew Research showed that Muslims are actually highly assimilated into American society. And I know a lot of people might chafe at that. They might have seen one or two very traditional Muslims out in their society and think this is not true. But a Gallup poll showed the same, confirmed that 69% of Muslim Americans identify extremely with the U.S. and its values. And it bears out what I've thought a lot of times, is that a lot of the people that come here, they want to be Americans. And a lot of people that do end up here, particularly from the Middle East, are people who have been persecuted in their home countries and have everything to gain by coming here, particularly in a country like the United States, where we do have a huge amount of religious freedom, contrary to what a handful of people might think. Most Muslims adopt U.S. customs and way of life, so that for the most part they blend in. And I know that's been my experience too. I worked in the food industry for a long time and met a lot of really interesting Muslim characters in that business. And for the most part, they were adapting to the U.S. customs and U.S. way of life and doing business very effectively, and were very adamant about doing so. 3.3 million Muslims in the U.S., 1% of the populations. So that's really pretty small. Jews in the United States are 3% of the population. They have overwhelming representation in U.S. culture, unlike Muslims, who have very small impact on U.S. culture. And even estimates, we have Muslims as 1% of the population now, estimates that they're still only going to be at 2% by 2050. So in another 35 some years, the Muslim population in the United States is still only going to be 2%. So this idea that a lot of Americans get, that Muslims are going to come over here and really kind of take things over and are going to infiltrate, or just, like I say, I think really misguided. And once again, there's hardly any representation of Muslims in American culture. We have 2 Muslims in Congress, 6,000 Muslims in the U.S. military. The number of mosques in the U.S. has doubled since 2001, in spite of 9/11. But once again, a pretty small number. But the representation is fairly small. Muslim support of American ideals higher than the general population. So there's an interesting little statistic. It shows that Muslim immigrants are actually more supportive of American ideals than most Americans in the general population. There's a high rate of U.S. citizenship among Muslims, and they take the legal route. And unfortunately, they are the targets of a lot of hate crimes. So they're actually the ones that have something to worry about coming to this country, that they're going to be a target, not that Americans are going to have to worry about being a target of Muslim immigrants. So there you have a fairly quick but sober look at the Islamic Muslim refugees coming to the United States and the issue. And doesn't seem to be much there as far as I'm concerned. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too?